like to welcome everybody to this one of the first conversation sessions actually at the ABLE Annual Meeting 2021. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Gloria Poveda, Liz Ryder-Baxmeyer, and Jill Dahlman from California North State University College of Health Sciences, who will lead this conversation session with you today and have a lot of questions that they can share and make it a really interactive session. And the title of this conversation session, but I'm pretty sure we'll also get to some other topics amongst the question, is how a partnership with a national park during a pandemic addresses the inequities of higher education, access to collaboration, authentic assignments, mental health, and disabilities. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the team and let's have a great conversation.
Thank you for having us.
All right, so welcome everyone. As Liz is sharing her screen. There we go. So today we're going to speak to you about a partnership that we made with Lassen Volcanic National Park, which is about 3 hours north of us, 2.5, 3 hours, somewhere around there. And this was a interdisciplinary project that was undertaken by English, humanities, and service learning. Okay. So just to give you some kind of a setup, before the pandemic even hit, I was trying to partner with Lassen Volcanic National Park because I'm a firm believer in something called authentic assignments. And so the authentic assignments is basically something where we're moving the audience from an individual, which would be the teacher in high school, to a general public. And that would then allow for an emphasis on rhetoric. So when you're writing for a teacher specifically, you have a specific way of writing. But if you're writing to an unknown, which is the public, you have a totally different way of writing. And so we kept this through, it is genre-based, but it's incorporating narratives and compare and contrast and cause and effect. But the genre-based is not solitary. And by that, I mean that we don't specifically say you will write a narrative, you will write a compare and contrast. Instead, we incorporate all of those elements into one single assignment. So just to set the stage for this, why are we bothering with this? John Dewey claims that no educational transaction can be complete without curiosity. If the student is not familiar with the historical, if the student is not familiar, then what's going to happen is there's going to be an inequity right there. If they're not curious in the least, there's going to be an inequity that we need to go ahead and cover. Paulo Freire, I don't think there's anybody who could speak more to higher ed inequities than him. He admonished the banking system of education in the pedagogy of the oppressed. And so, again, he was addressing inequities because there are so many different types of learning styles and things of that nature that help. And now we're also extending the seminal text by Kenneth Bruffy of collaborative learning and the conversation of mankind, which many people are familiar with. And this whole project was collaborative learning. And then finally, we're incorporating Thomas Dean's writing partnerships, service learning in composition. So it's writing for the community, writing about the community, and writing with the community, all of which is to say that we are working with Lassen. So we are not working with Lassen. I think that's the easiest way to put it. So.
And that's one of the national parks that's close to us that is fairly underserved and underfunded and understaffed, especially in the era of COVID, and they're not having they weren't having many visitors, and we found they're exponentially busier now because things have opened back up there. But what national parks are near all of you that are close by, but perhaps a little underserved? It'd be really interesting to know, in different places.
Feel free to put your answer into the chat, and we'll go ahead and address what you might do to help them.
Or I guess also grab the mic quickly if you prefer to speak.
Yeah. It's my understanding that there's pretty much a national park near everybody. So, but dunes, get National Seashore falls into that definitely, because there's national historical monuments, there are national memorials. Denali, oh God, Denali.
Ooh,
Craters of the Moon is so cool. One of my favorites. I've been to at least half of the national parks. So
Same. Yeah.
I do have favorites, and I shouldn't say it like that, but I do have favorites. So, so okay, great.
But thinking about this era of COVID and working collaboratively, and service learning being, at some point here, we'll discuss a little bit about our campus and how our program works. And so service learning being such an integral part of it, finding partnerships that we knew we were going to have to work with virtually was very intentional to then partner it with somebody, with something like a national park. Like, what do they do when you have to shut everything down? And that is how they survive. That's their livelihood. And from a health science campus where students are, have the pathway and they want to go into the medical field, like how does all that come together? And that really was sort of like the pushing force of the authentic assignment during this time.
Yeah.
For the next slide.
We'll grab that next slide.
Yeah, so some of the things that we did, we didn't introduce ourselves too fully, but Jill and I teach English composition, first year composition, amongst other humanities subjects. And then Gloria is the director of service learning, and so she's involved with service learning with students and community outreach. And this has really been something that we could the prompts that we were given by the park and the needs that were expressed to us kind of span multiple disciplines. So it's been really interesting to kind of integrate their needs into our needs, I suppose, as an academic institution. We treated the information slightly differently, which was an interesting experience for the students, because some of the students were taking service learning and English at the same time, I believe. And so got to see how we treated that information differently and those prompts slightly differently. So what we did in our English classes was we kind of built a course around the prompts that were given. We kind of divvied out, which there were about 150, right, Jill, when they sent them to you? It was
and they've been accumulated over 20 years, which is really the point that we don't know what a lot of these national organizations are going through. This was on their wish list, and we're like, just give us something that you don't mind waiting a full semester for.
Right. Yeah, and so we got to, as instructors, got to kind of play to our strengths a little bit, and that we chose the prompts that we thought we could support the best with our students. So I have a background in music and sound design, as well as writing. And so I chose things that perhaps we could make podcasts for or make websites for. I thought that would be a really fun way to kind of break down some of those prompts. And then Jill had her students, that a lot of them made figures. They made, was it sculptures of bats to show white nose syndrome?
This is not meant to be flippant. I have a Batmobile in my office to demonstrate the effects of white nose syndrome on bats, and it's going to go in the Children's Discovery Museum at Lassen.
Nice.
Yeah, and so we all produced these, or had supported students in producing all of these professional tools that to give to the community. And so there was an initial exploratory essay where we had students just explore the subject. They picked a prompt, explored the subject surrounding it to learn about it. And then we put them together in groups of 2 or 3 and had them kind of mesh their prompts, choose one prompt, but kind of mesh what they'd learned, because they all kind of bled into one another in some way or another. And so they had this kind of comparative strategy going in. And then they had to create a project proposal, research proposal, just like you would for any, creating work for any outside organization. And then a lesson plan and some educational materials, plus the actual project itself, either a podcast, 3D models, websites, brochures, interactive maps, anything that lent itself to the idea of public education, but also help them kind of put together, synthesize everything that they had learned and solidify it into one cohesive project. And then for service learning, they did a portfolio. So
And I'll say quickly, the portfolio was, I was coming into this very old school and it was more of a binder. And then we realized that we couldn't do that because we were in Zoom school. So the portfolio took a different, so then it became a thing, like it needs to be virtual. I mean, it's going to be online. It has to be easily put together and anybody can open it. And what are we going to include? So while, the Jill and Liz's class had very, writing intensive assignments for them to do that from the service learning perspective, the portfolios included, they needed to do archival history on the park. They needed to, meet with park officials, do interviews, ask questions, and then figure out from the list, I did, curate, I handpicked the projects I really wanted to see done and set up teams. And then they, again, put together to the list. They put together, they did interactive maps, they did brochures, websites. They started a change.org petition to, and they got the 100 signatures and moved that forward. There were QR code things, so it was there was a lot of, I would say, in terms of being interdisciplinary, that our students could work, across the courses, but definitely their final assignments were different. And our class did do a portfolio in the end.
And that all culminated in we have Research Day, or Research and Service Learning Showcase, and it's the first time that writing classes were involved in that. And so they got to present, that's where students present all day in a conference-like setting where they can share what they learned and what they created. And they got to kind of experience, each other's projects from different classes. So I think we had, this is 4 or 5 different sections of classes we're talking about taking on all these projects. They got to share what they'd done. And in creating the projects, and we'll show a couple of them later, and how they might be useful for a portfolio is, they had to think about all sorts of things. They weren't just writing for themselves or their instructors, and so they had to think about, accessibility issues, things like that. When they're writing for the community, when you have a lot of writing, perhaps you need some audio with that, maybe, different ages of audiences in different locations. I had them think about, what educational tools, how would you connect the idea of a national park to a child in, central LA, so maybe not have the same access to wilderness as other people might. So they really had to think about accessibility in all of these projects, as well as, different registers of speech and ways of connecting with the public. We have a few example prompts that we can share with you just to show you the types of things we're looking at here, but they really varied a lot. So things like creating educational resources for endangered species or species of concern in the parks. They had a list here, the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon. I don't know if anyone chose the peregrine falcon. They tended to choose the things that they thought were the coolest, so we tried to kind of sell up a lot of these, like these are all important, and I think they understood, through their research how one species affects another. And we definitely learned a lot about these species and how they interact through learning about, reading all of their papers and viewing their projects. But the red fox, the snowshoe hare, other ones. And then butterfly populations in the Lassen Volcanic National Park region, and effects of climate change. There are a few on climate change and human encroachment, habitat change. They also investigated things like forest fires, which are really have been detrimental in California as well as other places over the last few years. So that was a big area of interest. And then threats to wilderness character. And so everything, there was a public impact statement, public health impact statement attached to all of these. So we got them to think about why they were researching the materials, and what they could find out that would be helpful to others wanting to learn more. Perhaps there's a behavior change, or just some kind of general awareness that needed to be instilled. But there were a lot of these. Some of them we couldn't tackle because they were very scientific, and so we're kind of nudging the biology professors to kind of get involved.
So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits and opportunities for growth. Most of our demographic is more on the privileged side than other public schools. But we're trying to go ahead and make them aware of the inequities that surround them. So one of the ways we did this was to go ahead and talk to them about what is missing. So for example, when it comes to disability, we would have them take a look at what are the best ways to convey the information that you have discovered to all types of people, not just people who look like them, but people who are different. And so that we thought was really important. And it was a very positive impact on that community because you would watch them engage with each other and saying, wow, okay, so how do we go ahead and make this more interesting for the people who maybe need help with sight? Okay, so that would be something that we would have tackled in watching them tackle. So we took the core ideas of authentic assessment and authentic problem-based learning by simulating these real world scenarios. We're trying to encourage the students to explore the world around them because, like I said, our students are they're highly focused individuals, and getting them to stop thinking about the grade, so to speak, and focus more on the world around them was, I think, one of the biggest benefits, which did give them an opportunity to really have a sense of empathy. And I felt that this particular project really did provide an opportunity for direct and positive impact on the Lassen Volcanic National Park community. And by community, we talk about the economy of the community, because a lot of these smaller communities around the national parks, if they don't have a national park, there is no economy. Their entire economy revolves around the location of the national park, the proximity for hotels and restaurants and little things to do. That does make a difference. And so students were learning the direct and positive impact on Lassen and its surrounding communities. So we also worked with them on reading, research, and writing skills. And I can say that a poll that I gave my students regarding the types of reading they were doing, they indicated to me that in a course reflection letter that the reading that they undertook was far more serious because they knew they were writing for scientists, and that really kind of made them take their writing course a little more seriously. So we're obviously looking to connect the students to the outside world and explore the psychological benefits of nature. But Gloria's group went a little bit further than that.
So I'll add a couple of things to all of this, and that is we're here to talk about e-portfolios.
Yes.
So I will say that the pandemic in of itself provided this opportunity for some of these conversations, as Jill was mentioning, this sort of heightened sense of responsibility and a sense of empathy, and and the direct impact. A lot of times those conversations are harder to have in person, that you start to unpack them and it becomes very personal in a way that sometimes makes it harder to have the conversation. And what I think we have talked about this, the three of us have, and I found in my class in particular, were that doing it through this virtual modality, this platform of Zoom, and where everything had to be communicated through email, and making sure that the package we were, sending back and forth, right, this portfolio back and forth to Lassen, took on a different, asking those questions, that again, that heightened sense of responsibility, that sense of empathy, all of those, I believe, were really heightened. And it made it so that the students in some way, we were talking about this before the presentation today, was this, I was, when I grew up, so it was like the Karate Kid effort of where, they're picking up on skills and all the traits and the things we would like, but very organically. So by doing this, they were seeing the limits of being virtual and what we couldn't accomplish. And in regards to service learning, that's huge because we don't want them to come, to show up to the park as volunteers and what do you want me to do? And just point at me and let me do my hours. But it becomes, we're partners in this endeavor. And so we're coming to you, we're undergraduates at this health and science campus. We want to be in the healthcare profession. We have a set of skills, like we know we have resources. How can we partner? And let's look at these projects that you have and what can we help, to bring those to fruition. So it became really a really, really, I think, great opportunity to have students when they began to really see themselves as partners and that awareness, there was this purpose right outside of themselves. And it really, began to show how they were, really moving from like rote educational practices that they may have had in their, K through 12 experience to really like owning and designing their educational trajectory and those outcomes. And they were doing that in collaboration, in partnerships, and being really mindful about the product that that deliverable that they were bringing forward. And all of this being done in this portfolio sense, at least in my class, right? And in, all of our classes, because we had to package everything up and send it to the Lassen, Volcanic National Park people, and we were in communication back and forth. So I think there was a lot of benefit and opportunity for growth in this collaboration during this pandemic, right? So as we're exiting out, we'll see what happens, once we're back in person. But I think that as the that the sort of marker of like, it's this pandemic, we can't, they can't do their job. We're trying to do ours. Here's what we're going to do. How do we fix this? It was very, Mission Impossible-esque for them to think about, like, let's put it all together and how do we bring this forward? How do we do this? And then that, again, like the impact of the community and that sense of empathy and heightened responsibility, I think was really, like curating those, curating your aspirations is really like the platform that they had in these projects and in these courses. I can keep going on a tangent, but
no, it's wonderful. I think as an institution, we're really trying to move toward that as well. We think about this across programs, is how can we get students to think about how they will practice with empathy. I mean, a lot of our students are aspiring doctors. They want to go to medical school. They want to be MDs. Some of them want to be physical therapists and dentists and psychologists, but I'd say the majority want to be medical doctors. And so we really try to think about this early on, like what kinds of doctors do we need? Like we need people who are empathetic. We need telemedicine is another huge thing that's on the rise, and that people have been thrown into. I mean, I know doctors who've been practicing for years who were thrown into the pandemic and are not well versed in telemedicine because they haven't had to do it very much before. And so this is really a new world that I think we're coming out of the pandemic into, and especially regarding the medical field. And so, I think this is another aspect of this project that Gloria was just explaining is how students conduct themselves in online environments with the public. Constructing those emails is useful at a writing level and makes them think about what they're putting on the page more deeply, perhaps. And then working with people at the park, and we worked closely with the park ranger, who was our first kind of port of contact, and filtering some of these ideas and giving real world feedback. This is going to work. This isn't going to work. You need to be careful about these questions you're asking if you want to interview this population to glean information. And so they had to kind of face a lot of these real world challenges. And there were posed questions that perhaps they hadn't been challenged with before. And it really made them consider, how they would work with the community, I think. This in kind of simulating this idea of creating for the community, then I think it made them visualize what their future might look like a little bit. How they would explain processes that are scientific and tricky in some ways, and how they would communicate that to different audiences, because that's really what they're going to have to be doing every day when they're medical doctors. And so the earlier that we can kind of get them comfortable with that dynamic, the better.
We have a raised hand, so let's go ahead and find out whether or not there's a question or something else.
There's actually a question, Jill, from my end. I'm wondering, since Liz, you just mentioned that the park rangers worked very closely with the students and gave them feedback. Was that done primarily in person or in conversations, or did they actually also take a look at the student portfolios?
It's Zoom.
Zoom
is your friend.
Zoom and my class did have, we added them so that they could access. So we were doing like the portfolio creation was sort of like on a shared document that the students would answer questions, and that would be the best way of communication. And when we really needed something, like Jill was saying, that we just couldn't, if we were getting lost in translation on our own communication through the portfolio, then we might set up a Zoom or invite them to the class is what I would. So I had them come to my class, I would say 3 times during this, like at the beginning of the semester, and sort of present everything and his information. Then that's where we created the shared document that turned into the portfolio for each project. And then sort of midterm time, they checked in, and then he came to our presentations when we did those.
Yeah. And the other thing too that I want to point out is that he frequently would say something to me like, oh, hey, there were students working on an invasive weed situation. The bull thistle is the one that they concentrated on. So he said, well, we've got, this plan that's 15 years old. How about if I forward the plan and see if that can help inform them on what their suggestion or solution to the problem might be. And one of the students took biocontrol, and another one took chemical control, and the third person took how to prevent it to begin with. So it was all really well done in terms of the connections that they were able to make. And I know that Gloria told me that one of the scientists from Lassen contacted one of the students.
On that document, as we were sharing in our portfolio, in our shared portfolio, our contact person had put in like the links and stuff and of other people at the park. So that was really nice, because one of the groups, so we did like a fire lookout group. And so they contacted the person who had like really mapped that out. And then they ended up working with the team to develop like a new map for fire lookouts. And then one of the scientists that, a geologist, as a matter of fact, but then he did like a Zoom with the students. So but it made the communication was much more streamlined than waiting for emails, for example, because I think we've all been really impacted in emails during this pandemic. So having the portfolio as that shared document as a way to communicate, and we were, each group had to check theirs daily, and I think it did help out in keeping the communication open.
So let's if we could move to the slide on the benefits of the e-portfolio, and then the samples.
The samples, yeah.
So that people could see what we did and how we did it. There we go.
Yeah. So I'll share the materials. So why don't you guys kick off the public persona?
Unless I can copy the links if you like.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. These are in the site as well. I'll do a separate share actually at the end of this slide to show you some of the things that the students made that actually they could include actually in any kind of portfolio, I think, showing community projects and the skills. I mean, a lot of them learned, or got to use their creative skills, which is something they hadn't gotten to do for a while, especially in such a focused program. And something that we're really trying to work on with students, and I think this is good for anyone going into any professional field, but specifically doctors and medical professionals, because I think it's one of the most difficult jobs in society. I think service jobs. It's emotionally draining. and very rewarding, but extremely challenging and unpredictable a lot of the time. So I think curating a public persona that is appropriate to that level of service is so important. And our students, they're getting there, but they're not quite there yet. And so these types of projects really help them think about how they're looking to the rest of the world and what they want people to see and what they don't want people to see. So creating a public persona, or making the personal public, because I think definitely we want to know our doctors quite well. You know, we don't need to know everything about them, but it's nice to know a few details so you can connect with them. To empower the self through curating an informed public persona. That's something we're really working across programs with our students on. Something that was mentioned earlier, making aspirations a reality. You know, getting to see the great reflective tool, getting to see yourself on the page and how that looks and how that might look to others can be very powerful and very, I think, a great learning experience for the self. Then highlighting the relationship between the community partner and the academic disciplines that that we're applying these projects to. And again, kind of synthesizing that information, getting to see what people are doing across programs is super important. And the projects that we have to show you are, we picked a couple that were pretty outstanding. One was on soundscape of the park and one was on climate change and how that affects various species in the park. And we thought that they did a really great job of making the information digestible. You know, it really sprung off the page, literally. They created their own artwork for it. And so had they not done this project in the way that we did, they wouldn't have been able to express these skills. And I think that's something that will be, they got to discover things about their skills, like technical and artistic, that they could apply to a portfolio that I think would make them stand out. And then awareness of difference in ability and accessibility, creating those tools, they had to think about who is this for, think about audience, think about limitations that audiences may face, depending on a variety of factors, making sure that their visuals and their writing was accessible to all populations. Which is something, again, if you're doing an assignment that's just for your instructor, you don't always have to think about those things. And so this also is geared towards helping future doctors think about and make initial considerations about how they communicate with people that they may be working with. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick reshare because I have the website open. I think I'll share this particular one and then you can explore the others, and please feel free to ask questions or follow along with us. Let's see here, I'll do a new share.
And once we finish showing that, we'll go ahead and open everything to questions and comments and have that conversation that we keep promising.
So this is one in particular that, and I don't know if all the features are going to work just because of the Zoom and having to pick out pop-up videos and things like that. But this particular project was students working on climate change and how it affected species in the park that are becoming endangered or are endangered because of climate change. And so they created this, they did all of their own artwork. They created this interactive map and implemented all of the elements themselves. And so first of all, this is a really engaging looking map. It's easy to understand. They put a little map up here so you can see where Lassen was. If you know, a lot of people don't know about this park. You know, it's fairly small in, you know, we have Yosemite. So of course, everything else is going to kind of be shadowed by that. And so you can click on any of these, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see the pop-up here. Let's see the American pica. I'm going to open that up there. Can you see that pop-up?
Mm-hmm.
You can? Okay, wonderful. And so they have these small pop-up windows where you can learn a little bit more about the animal. It has keywords underlined, and then it will take you to a new page with all of the information on the species, and you can learn more. And they created a worksheet to go with this that asked them specific questions about what information on the website so they could check for understanding and learning. And and just put together this kind of beautifully compiled resource for the park. And then they had a separate page on climate change. Again, put together some easy to understand visuals, and then a how to help section at the bottom of their information page, so you can see how to get involved. So they kind of brought everything full circle. And there are a lot of projects like this. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that's really key with portfolios is that it's a question of curation. So, you're curating your best products to show to the instructor, to your peers, to whomever. But in this particular instance, they're curating for a general public. So they were careful to go ahead and make certain that the information they provided was not going to be too difficult to understand or things of that nature.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Like that huge point of, gosh, what I'm saying absolutely has to be true. Even in an academic paper, I think they still feel there's wiggle room for, well, this is a learning experience. And yes, it is. This is all a learning experience, but it's also, yes, you have to be accountable now for the things you're saying and doing, not just make it look nice. And so that was definitely something that was on people's minds.
Steve asked whether or not Lassen put the projects on their website. We are working with them. In fact, we have a meeting with Jason, our ranger contact, this week, and we're not only talking about the fall semester and doing more projects, but we're talking about ways of transferring this information so that he can have it placed on the Lassen Volcanic National Park website.
So the change.org that the students in my class took up to make the Pacific Crest Trail a national sort of landmark trail, may have it recognized, that was on there for a little bit while they got the amount of signatures that they needed. And so now it's the students are actually still working with them to create like the document that then gets sent out. So, but yeah, so some of the,
yeah.
But it is true, the portfolio had to represent that deliverable to the community partner, which was Lassen. So there was a definitely heightened level of responsibility to make sure that it was professional and ready. And
yeah, definitely.
All right. So I think we'll enter into that conversation part. Does anyone have questions or comments, or can anyone make suggestions on where we might want to take this next? That would be great.
Or if you've done anything like this, please share.
Yes.
yeah.
So I think you're calling.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I think you're calling it authentic assignments, and what language I am familiar with and I have used is non-disposable assignments. And there's a really great quote out there by David Wiley. I just searched it up. These are assignments. So a typical assignment, like a paper, and one of you were mentioning about students doing a paper and they might not feel as much pressure to be honest because only their instructor is seeing it, and then they know it's going to go in the trash at the end, right? This isn't going to anybody besides their instructor or maybe their TA. And there's this great quote that says, disposable assignments are assignments that students complain about doing and faculty complain about grading. They're assignments that add no value to the world. After a student spends 3 hours creating it, the teacher spends 30 minutes grading it, and then the student throws it away. And what I'm seeing is exactly the opposite, what you've done here. The websites that you showed us through are so beautiful. I learned something very quickly just looking at it with the different types of flora and fauna that are in your area. It's just really exciting to see work like this that is being valued by both the instructors, but also the community and community connections like the park rangers. That's really exciting. We've seen a bit of this type of work at my institution, but I think you have such a great example I'd like to share with people. So thank you for sharing.
Sure,
Yeah,
for sure.
This type of thing is something that anyone can do, right? Everyone has, and it doesn't have to be a national park necessarily. You know, we're thinking about expanding into different community partners, and it happens to be that, you know, organizations with scientific interest kind of match with our goals as an institution, because we have a lot of health sciences students. But arts, liberal arts organizations, there are lots of those out there. If you're working with a liberal arts college, and especially now, the need for content is so huge. In the era of COVID, we have a local art studio called Clara Art Center in Sacramento, who just launched an online program for education for underserved students in the community, usually K through 12. But there are so many opportunities in the community that are worth exploring with this type of work, and so beneficial to the students as well as the community, I think, on different levels.
And because we're opening back up ever so slightly this fall, we're also looking into partnering with places that are a little bit closer, like Fairy Tale Town, which is not that far away, and the Sacramento Zoo, which is across the street from Fairy Tale Town, to see if we can get them in there and write at the same time. So those kinds of things I think are really important for students, because then they see that there is a value to their writing.
Yeah. It was tricky, right? The sell from our end, because what really helped was that interaction with Jason, with the park, so that they were getting that, that validation that it was going somewhere, and when they get to see it. But we're hoping that to maintain the portfolio the way we do, to package and deliver that to the community partner we're working with. But in addition, now if we can be in person and have the students, maybe, we had so many different interactive brochures and like maps for people to check out. So I know that they're eager to get in there and see let me go and scan my QR and do the map that I designed or I created. So that'll be an interesting addition.
Mm-hmm. And if anything, a lot of the students that we have, they're trying to stay local, and so they're getting to know their community better, and they can demonstrate that later on through a portfolio. I did this project with this organization. And if you want to be a doctor in your community, I think it's really important to show that you have served that community in other ways, not just wanting to be a medical doctor and serve the individual.
Steve, you had a question.
A question and a comment. The comment is that at IPUI, and my colleague Debbie H. Miner should be in this session, but she is part of a course that's our second semester professional writing course. And they've, for a number of years now, been doing group projects in the class with organizations to produce this kind of authentic material. And it really does create a great sense of meaning. As you said, it's not a disposable project by any means, and there's an interaction with a community partner who then sees the final product, and Debbie's been working to try to incorporate this more into an online kind of e-portfolio presence at the end. So a question I had was, were all the students in the writing class also into service learning, or just some of them were, and how did that I wasn't exactly sure how that differed between what they did for the one writing class and what they did for the service learning.
Some were in both, but not all. But I'm going to let Gloria tackle this because it's interesting.
We had a shared student that we realized quickly when I got a really intense question asked about, and I thought, wow, and so I heard the question and I thought, I'm so excited that this student is really taking this to this next level that I hadn't even thought about for my class. And so then I went back to the lecture and I made it I think we should all learn from this experience. And I made a big deal. And then the student came to me afterwards and said, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to add more work to any of us. I was trying to see if I could just do a twofer, and so I thought, awesome. Now we know, but you know what? We're going to level this portfolio up, because for the service learning class, it really is the deliverable and the interactions and how do they communicate with the community partner. Their class is the English composition course. So there, and we did have and mine was very collaborative. The students had to do everything with their their group. And so, but that added an extra layer. And then we started just meeting more regularly to see how we were going to make sure we differentiated our assessments. But it was the first time we did this, and we're in the pandemic. So we have learned, and we are moving forward.
But I think what helped is that Gloria staked her claim on a few assignments, on a few prompts. And Liz had her set of prompts, because we divvied what was remaining up between the two of us, so that her students had a distinct set, my students had a distinct set, and her students, but there was still some crossover.
It was the white nose bat. We all wanted the white nose bat.
Yeah,
so
it
ended up on all of, so that's what happened. And so,
yeah. But there's a raised hand here. So.
Hi, I'm Carol. This has been fascinating to listen to. I feel like I'm coming from a little bit different perspective. I'm in a K-12 school, and we've been using portfolios it's been part of our community since the school began in '94, and we've recently moved over to e-portfolios. But it was interesting, listening to that perspective. And what you're doing, we do a lot of those similar things here, but I hadn't ever thought of the component of then taking that portfolio and making it a semi-public, with a password type of a system, if you will, to then share out. We have 3 times a year, we do these things called intensives, and students participate in all kinds of things that are topics of interest to them and relevant, and they're learning together. For example, one recently was a physics class. They got physics credit, but they, a couple of days, they went to the billiard hall and they learned about the physics of playing pool. And they used a portfolio to house their learning and, share with their teacher, but thinking about how something like that could take that next step. Could that have been something to then present to the billiard hall owner or, members there? What would have been that, just that one little next piece to it. We're actually trying to think about how to, for our seniors, we do student-led conferences twice a year, and how to shift our seniors from our traditional student-led conference to more of a conference where they're, I don't like the word defending their portfolio, but creating a portfolio based on, are they going into college, career, workforce, military, and doing some work around that, and then presenting it not only to their parent and advisor like they do, but then including a larger audience of myself. If they're going into military, invite a military person in. If they're going into career, invite somebody from that career field. So just listening to what you're saying is making me kind of, come back to conversations we've been trying to start to have and how we kind of keep moving forward. So thank you for sharing.
Happy to share. We're going to have to wrap this up because I think we have 2 minutes left to the hour. So
we have hands up
on the PowerPoint slides that we constructed and you should have access to, our email addresses are there, and we're happy to Zoom with anybody. We can, if you just want to email one, that's great. Feel free to get in touch with us. We're happy to be there.
And again, the whole thing is collaborative. So I know I've done e-portfolios like this with other campuses and done projects, and things of the, just to keep that communication going. For what Carol's saying, my background is in education, and we do a lot of work with K-12 schools.
Okay, so thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Much appreciated, and we hope you have a glorious day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria, Jill, and Liz, for sharing your project with Lassen Volcanic Park with us, and also pointing out how the portfolio activities can really help bring across empathy and getting students involved, even if they do that all at a distance. So I'm sure as the questions, or the raised hands have shown there are more questions than we had time to look into for the time being. So please do feel free to use Slack for further communication. And if you have not yet put in your pitch for our Shark Tank on the last day of the conference, you still have time to do so until about 5 p.m. your local time today. And we'd love to hear from more projects, and the Shark Tank is a great opportunity not to be eaten, thankfully, but to receive wonderful feedback from experienced ePortfolio practitioners and researchers on your portfolio idea, and see if you kind of can make it happen at some point. And I heard there will be prizes as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.